Hi there, Lindsay here, the Frugal Crafter. Today we are going to do an oil pastel painting, and I'm using a reference photo from the Food Paint Challenge on Instagram. I'm also painting on a DaVinci Pro panel, which they come unfinished, and I coated it with black acrylic paint and put 2 coats of clear gesso on it. And I've put my oil pastel trays all around me on my table so I can have access to everything. It's a little overkill, but I just felt like playing with oil pastels. And the clear gesso I'm using is by Liquitex, and it has a certain amount of grit to it. It almost feels sandy. So I would recommend that brand just because I've tried other brands and they're not as gritty and they don't work quite as well. So really would recommend just buying the Liquitex. It might be a couple bucks more than other brands, but it is so worth it if you like to do color pencil or oil pastel work or soft pastel work. I'm sketching with a colored pencil. This is a Prismacolor colored pencil, and I like to combine my Prismacolor colored pencils with my oil pastels. Because Prismacolor color pencils are so soft and pigmented, they just work really well to go in and add details and clean up edges and whatnot with the oil pastels. I've tried other brands, and for whatever reason, the Prismacolor has just worked the best for me out of all the brands that I've tried for this particular technique. So, you know, you can try what you have, and if it works, great, and if it doesn't, then maybe try the Prismacolor. I wanted to have a little bit more in this still life than just the coffee pot or the percolator and the cup. So, and I actually, after I was looking at this, I'm like, I don't think I want the cup there. I want to have the dish of lemons there because I have a little more space and I think it would look a little bit better. So I decided to just kind of change that up a bit. The downside of working on the gesso, that gritty surface, is that it is hard to erase. So, you may want to sketch on scrap paper that's like the same size as your canvas or your board, and then transfer after you've got your sketch all figured out. I know oil pastels are really opaque. They're going to cover up good, so I didn't really worry about it too much. My brain can kind of figure out what the lines are that I want to keep, and so this was fine for me. But if you want to be a little bit more careful about it or feel maybe a little bit more freer to sketch on some scrap paper, then go ahead and do that. Now, the other thing that I would change if I was going to do this again is that I would have sketched on the raw board, I think, and then I would have blocked in my colors with acrylic paint and then put my gesso on top. That way my oil pastels, I wouldn't have to use as much oil pastel to cover up some areas. But, you know, live and learn. I used a variety of different brands as well. I started off with my hardest pastels, which would be my Pentel. This is a Pentel oil pastel right here. A lot of people hate these and they like throw a lot of shade at them, but I love, look how opaque that is. I love the Pentel pastels. Somebody said that, actually a couple people have said that recently the Pentel pastels smell like gasoline when you buy them. I don't know if that's still the case, so if you've purchased these recently, please let me know, because I really like this brand of pastels for my first layer. They're so cheap. They're like under 10 bucks for a set of 50, and it's a really nice variety of colors, and I find that they stick to most surfaces, and even though they're harder, they have a lot of pigment to them. But anyway, my first layers would be my harder pastels, which would be the Pentel, which is probably my favorite hard pastel. Then there's the Craypas Expressionist, I think it is, and then there's the Crayola. So those are kind of the first layer I would do. I tend to trust the Pentel and the Craypas a little more than the Crayola. I don't know why. I just figured the Crayola might fade, but honestly, probably any of them could. I'm going to end up putting fixative on this anyway, so I'm not too worried about it, but just to kind of give you the heads up. But if you have a variety of softnesses when you're doing oil pastel, you'll be able to layer up more rather than just using one set of pastels that are all the same softness. You're only going to be able to layer up so much. Like if I was using my favorite pastels, which are probably, I don't know, I like the Sennelier a lot, but I also like the new Q-Lock square pastels I got recently. If I was just doing everything with one brand, I would be limited to the amount of layering I could add, because you kind of want to work fat over lean, which means you use your less oily layers first and your harder layers first, and then you work up with your softer, more oily layers, because those softer layers will stick on top of those harder layers. Same thing with the soft pastels as well, like the chalk pastels, chalky feeling pastels. Same thing with oil paints. With oil paints, you would do your first layer with that was like lean, which meant instead of adding fat or oil to your oil paint, you'd add solvent such as mineral spirits. And then as you progressed, you would add more oil, like linseed oil or whatever oil you like to use, whatever drying oil you like to use for glazes. You'd add more oil to those layers, and those top layers would dry more slowly, and they would bond and give a chance for the bottom layers to dry all the way. And it's just a good way to work. It's a good archival way to work. And if you're mixing media, same thing. Like I did I primed this with acrylic paint, and then I used an acrylic gesso. So now I'm using oil stuff on top of that because those products are completely dry and stable and ready to go. Now what I talked about, the underpainting, if I had to do this again, I would have sketched it first, then I would have painted like the back of the wall blue, this table yellow, the curtain yellow. I would have done that just really roughly because it would have conserved my oil pastels a bit. As you can see, it did take a lot of the yellow to stick over and to cover up over that black. And I did get to a point where I couldn't add more, so I had to spray it with workable fixative and then add some more to make it fully opaque. So that's what I was saying about doing the underpainting in acrylic before the gesso. It would have saved me some time as well. This, I was looking at the footage before I time-lapsed it, and it was like 3 hours of footage, but a couple times, it's probably more like 2.5 hours, because a couple times I forgot to turn the camera off, probably because my hands were covered with oil pastel, and so the camera just ran. So it was probably a little bit closer to 2.5 hours, but still, I bet that would have knocked an extra half hour off that process time, not to mention saved my materials a bit if I did it that way. So I want to talk about how I store my oil pastels, because you can see these trays all over my table. These are oil pastel, or I don't know if they're necessarily called pastel trays, but I have a set for my chalk pastels and I have a set for my oil pastels. And you know, chalk pastels are also called soft pastels, but I don't want to confuse you guys, so I'm calling the soft pastels chalk pastels, and I'm calling the oil pastels oil pastels. So I have a set of drawers for my chalk pastels, I have a set of drawers for my oil pastels, and then I just spread the trays around my table when I'm working. I could go in and just kind of pick and choose the colors and just put that on a dish on my table as well. But, you know, this is also easy. I have more than you need. I also want to make a mention of that. If I was just starting out, like say something happened and I lost my stash, what I would do is I would buy a set of the Pentel. I would buy a set of either Mungio soft oil pastels or the Culox soft oil pastels. And I would buy a set of either Sennelier oil pastels, or I would buy the Paul Rubens Haya oil pastels. So I would have a hard oil pastel, a medium oil pastel, and a super soft oil pastel. And that would give me the greatest layering capabilities. And I would probably stick with more of I would start off with the classic ranges of pastel, and then I would probably get like a muted or lighter, like pastel toned set, just to, you know, conserve my pastels a bit, just to broaden them out and make it so I don't have to mix everything. I can kind of lay down more pure strokes of color. The thing is, when you have dry media like markers or colored pencils or pastels, you need more colors than you would if you were using like tube paints, because tube paints, you mix them on a palette, you get exactly what you want, and you apply that brush stroke to the paper. You can keep those impressionistic, painterly strokes as you go with traditional paint. But when you're using a dry media that you're going to kind of draw on, you do need more colors. Otherwise, you're going to over blend everything and things just can get a little too blurry or muddy. So, I mean, you could obviously work with a more limited palette. I'm not saying you can't. You can see all the colors I use. I just leave on the napkin next to me so I can just go back to those colors. But, and I'm using a variety. You can see I've got some Crayolas out there even. That red Crayola is just so pretty and perfect for those underlaying cherries from the napkin. But it is nice to have that variety, and just, I would say, collect over time. And, you know, you see a good deal, maybe buy a little set, maybe buy a few open stock if you're noticing that, say, you're having a really hard time finding a high quality bright green pastel in the budget brands. Because most of my pastels are budget pastels, or not really expensive brands. The only expensive brand I have is Sennelier. But if I had a color that I just couldn't get a good quality color from the cheaper brands, I could order that in Sennelier. You know, I could wait till I had a few colors to get and buy a few and get a bulk discount and build up my stash that way. Now, I've worked with oil pastels on and off for, you know, years and years. I like to use them as underpaintings for oil paintings as well, for like sketching on canvas. And in fact, the first time I used oil pastels, it came in a kit that I got in like high school, and it came with a little container of Turpenoid, and I did whole paintings with just oil pastels, and it was so fun. It was such a great introduction to oil paint. So I think oil pastels became popular, and I don't know if Picasso invented them or had Sennelier make them for him, but he wanted the freedom of drawing, but he wanted the longevity of oil paint. He wanted to like draw with oil paint, and that's the lore that I was told. That's how oil pastels came to be. And there's something so magical and childlike about picking up an oil pastel. It just transports me back to being in second grade and it being Crepa Day in my class. I had a teacher, because back in the day, especially in rural Maine, we didn't have an art teacher until we got older. Our homeroom teacher had to do our art classes, and every once in a while my teacher would bring out the oil pastels, and I loved it. I just loved how creamy and smooth and opaque and vibrant and pigmented they were, and I get that same feeling every time I get out my oil pastels. And every time I do, I'm like, why don't I use these more? They're so fun. So I was really in the zone, in the flow state here, painting here. I did not narrate it, so there is no real-time tutorial for this, but I think it would be probably pretty boring, because there's a lot of repetition, and there's a lot of like me peeling wrappers off, and there's a lot of me just kind of like sitting back and thinking about it and all of that, but it was just so much fun. And what I really love about this is that I love online painting challenges like the food paint challenge, but sometimes you see the picture and you're just like, you're not that inspired by it. Maybe you like a part of it, but it's just not enough to make an artwork out of, in your opinion, especially because I wanted to work on a board. I wanted to work on a larger canvas, and I'm thinking this is either 9 by 12 or 11 by 14. And I needed a little bit more. And also I didn't want just yellow and silver. I wanted more color. I really wanted to throw in some turquoise and some red. And I just love the cherry motif in a kitchen, especially next to that vintage looking percolator. I just thought that was such a fun look. And I've been rewatching Twin Peaks. I haven't seen that in decades probably. And I always just think of like the FBI agent and his cup of coffee. Damn fine cup of coffee and cherry pie, cup of coffee and cherry pie. You know, I wanted to get that vibe in here as well. Another tip, and I share a lot of these tips in different oil pastel videos, and I have quite a few oil pastel videos on my YouTube channel, including a 10 tips for oil pastel video that's quite popular and I think really useful if you're either revisiting the medium or getting back into it. I love these little silicone tipped tools. They're sold for nail art, and they're so cheap and they work so good. And then another viewer recommended on my last video that they cut up white erasers and use them for blending oil pastel. And I thought, what a fantastic idea. In fact, you know, I bet you could get those pencil caps, the pencil cap erasers. Those would be ideal as well for blending. So get creative and use what you have. And oftentimes those are the best tools because they're free and they're not precious. And yeah, I mean, necessity is a mother of invention, as they say. I really like these because they're smaller than my fingertips. I am a fingertip blender, but these are smaller than my fingertips, and I can get into those little nooks and crannies, and I can smooth out an edge, and it really helps give you a little bit more control, kind of like you're using a paintbrush, right? The thing I do love about pastels is the directness, is the fact that there is no tool between me and the pastel and the canvas. You know, I'm just picking up the crayon basically and going to town like a child. And I think that's something that is good to get back to. I know it can be a little bit messy and a lot of people don't like that feeling on their hands, but I just keep a little spray bottle of rubbing alcohol on my table and a paper towel, and I spray the paper towel and I wipe off my fingers, and that works pretty well. That said, you know, it does get stuck to your fingernails, does get under your fingernails. You could wear gloves if you want to prevent that, but I am not a fussy fingernail person, and in the winter my nails are very short because they just get so dried out from hand washing and the cold weather and the dry weather that I don't even attempt. I might paint my nails and then it seems to make them even in worse condition, so I just keep them short, maybe put some clear nail polish on it, and whatever, they get stained by paint. I'm not gonna worry about it. The nice thing about reflective surfaces, such as the shiny white ceramic plate and cup and the percolator, is that you can bounce light and color around your picture. So you can bring some of the yellow and the turquoise and the white and the red and the black from different aspects of your painting in different areas, and you can bounce them off the faces of that silver that's facing the object you want to reflect. So that's kind of nice. It does help bring the eye around, and it does help kind of harmonize the painting because you're bringing those little bits of color here and there. I rarely add color to one section of a painting. I'm always going to bring it around somewhere else. Like here, I'm adding these yellow reflections. I'm just trying to think what could be hitting this in these different places where I'd have that reflection. Sometimes I do sneak more color in than it would normally be, but that's just because I like color and I like to boost the interest and make it just seem a little bit more appealing and enticing. When you're doing shadows on a surface, especially a light surface like bright yellow, you want to think of desaturating that yellow. You could shadow with, like, I ended up using kind of like a reddish brown, but you could also use like lavender. I use some like grayed lavender in the lemon slices themselves. I just would recommend keep layering up and darkening and playing until you feel like you've got a good balanced shadow that feels like it's adding the weight or carrying the weight of the object. Generally, you're going to have your darkest line or darkest portion of the shadow where the subject touches the surface that it's on. If you have a hard time getting that really dark line, you can go in with like a colored pencil and often sneak a nice dark line in there. If nothing else, you can scrape off the pastel and it will reveal the black underneath if you did the black underpainting like I did. As far as other surfaces for oil pastel, there's a lot of really nice ones. Paper works great for oil pastel, and to be honest, if you want the most longevity with your oil pastel, the way to preserve it would be to work on paper and then frame it with a mat so that nothing will touch the artwork, and under glass, not plexiglass, because plexiglass can flex and stick and touch the surface and stick to it. You want to make sure you have a little gap, a little airspace gap. So that's the best way. In reality, though, I know a lot of us like to just be able to display it so there's nothing between the artwork and our eyeballs. And in that case, you would want to use some different fixatives and potentially a varnish. Now, I am conducting some experiments on varnishing my oil pastels, but basically you want something that's not going to dissolve that layer. So you could try a couple, like maybe 4 layers of the Sennelier oil pastel fixative. It does give it a glossy coating. I still think it needs a varnish on top of that, and it does feel nice and dry to the touch, almost powdery after you do that. So I'm thinking I probably could go over that with a acrylic varnish. But I don't think I could just do acrylic varnish right on top of the oil pastel because the oil pastel surface is going to repel it. I think the fixative might give it enough of a seal that I could go over it with a more robust varnish. Honestly, I think, like, archivally, to stick to oil pastel, you'd want an oil-based varnish. However, the solvents in an oil-based varnish, where the oil pastels never really dry, I think would dissolve some of that film and smear it. So it's just kind of like, it's kind of tough. You might be able to spray several layers of an oil-based varnish on there. But anyway, I'm gonna do some practices and some tests and see if I can come up with something, because I absolutely love using oil pastels. And if I could just paint on these wooden boards and be able to varnish them and hang them like an oil painting, that would be great. Because then you don't have, I mean, you do have that weird time of the pastels just being sticky, but you don't have like the curing time of oil paint and the smell of oil paint and the solvents and the brushes to clean and all of that. I tend to avoid projects that involve a lot of setup or cleanup. And I think that's why I gravitate towards watercolor and other water-based mixed media, things like that. So, I mean, just knowing yourself, I think, is part of the battle as far as making your art practice work for you. If you find that you love painting, but you don't paint very much, think about what is the problem, what's keeping you from going to the studio or from pulling out your supplies. And it may be that it's a pain to pull out all my supplies. If you have to like set up your space every time you go to work and that takes a half an hour, that's a huge friction point. If you can leave stuff set out, or you can work with mediums that you just have to take the lid off a box of pastels or open up a watercolor palette and go, that might work out much better for you. So if you thought I'm an oil painter, I love oil painting, but you don't paint in that medium, maybe it's time to think about, okay, I love to oil paint, but just the setup is just too much for me right now in this season of life. Maybe I'll try pastels or oil pastels or watercolor, or even like my favorite acrylics are golden open acrylics. I generally don't love painting with acrylics, but those feel so much like oil paints. The way they blend, the way they stay wet, but they're dry in like 24 hours and they're like fully cured in a couple of days. And I get that joy of kind of like an oil painting experience without having the awful cleanup. It's just so much easier to clean things up, and I don't have to have wet painting sitting around for weeks, and it's just it just works with my current season of life. Back when I was doing a lot of oil paintings, I had a studio away from home, so I could leave my paintings up drying, fumes down there. I didn't have to have my fumes back at my home with my family. I also had a little more time. I didn't have children. It was it was a more, my time was my own a little bit back then. So, and even though now I'm getting to the point where my time is my own again, it's still, I've kind of gotten away from wanting to do that kind of fussy stuff as much. So just kind of recognize and embrace what season of life you're in, what your preferences are. Just because you loved something at one time doesn't mean you still love it. Doesn't mean you're always going to love it. We change, and that's totally fine. So find something that works with the season of life you are at. Now, as I go on through here and I'm adding more details, I'm going to work with my softer oil pastels. So if I've got like a lot of greasy layers here, probably the only highlight I'm going to be able to get to stick would be my Sennelier white, or maybe even my Paul Rubens Haya oil pastel white. But if I don't have a lot of greasy layers, I could use, say, a Mungyo white pastel. I bought a set of 6 white Paul Rubens oil pastels. Those are great. Those are quite soft. Not as soft as a Sennelier, but much cheaper. I think you got like a pack of 6 for the price of one Sennelier. And now Paul Rubens does have these huge jumbo sticks of their Haya oil pastels in white and black, and those are like the Sennelier ones. So there's some options there. But I guess I'm brand agnostic. I don't really care much who makes the supplies I use, as long as they're reliable. Now, as far as Lightfast testing, you can find Lightfast information on the Senneliers and on the Paul Rubens. Actually, a lot of oil pastel brands now that are kind of in the like 50 cent a stick range are offering Lightfast information and pigment information. So you can really be budget friendly and pick supplies that are going to work for you. Now, I'm not saying if you buy, like, say, the Paul Rubens set of 50 oil pastels and they have light fastness ratings and pigment information, I'm not going to tell you every stick in that box is going to be light fast. You're going to have to look at each color and each rating and make those decisions for yourself. Obviously, if you're framing under glass, if you're using fixatives and varnishes and stuff, you're going to be adding protection to your painting. But you can reasonably get a nice, stable, solid product that doesn't have to cost you an arm and a leg. And I think that's one of the things I like about oil pastels is there's a lower bar to entry than a lot of other media. And the fact that you can get a very similar to oil painting look without the fuss and without the fumes, I think is wonderful. And I've loved these since I was in 2nd grade. The fact that you could work with these with your kids, maybe not give them the artist grade ones, maybe give them like the Crapaud Junior or something like that, but the fact that you could work with them or give them a Crayola or whatever and they can have that experience, it's such a nicer experience. When you go from using crayons to using oil pastels as a child, there's like a certain magic that happens, and I think every child should be able to experience that. I think that when art teachers can budget oil pastels in their art rooms, that's a really excellent thing. And in fact, that's a great donation. If you have a ton of extra oil pastels, that's a wonderful donation to an elementary school art room or a library art program, because it's something that they might not get to experience at home because maybe their parents aren't very aware of these different art medias, or maybe the only time they used oil pastels was art class in high school and they don't really remember like being really into it. So yeah, I just think it's one of those magical mediums that every time I use them, I'm like, oh, why don't I use these more often? Now, I get questions about water-soluble oil pastels, and I like them too. They seem to be not quite as opaque, but so I'd use them on a lighter surface. I wouldn't use them on a black surface, and I would use them on watercolor paper. I think that's a really great surface, or maybe like matte board or even pastel paper, but you want something that can take the water that you're going to be adding to blend it out. Now, water-soluble oil pastels, I'm sorry for pulling this off the screen, I wasn't very aware of what I was doing right there. I'm just kind of sharpening up the shadow edges with this really dark, I think it's a black actually, color pencil. The thing with the water soluble oil pastels that's really nice is that you can add a lot of water and get kind of like a watercolor effect, but what I like to do is use small, flat, or filbert brushes, dip just the bristles into the water, tap it on a paper towel, and then blend like that if I want to use water. There's a couple brands that I really like. I like the Mungio water-soluble oil pastels, and I like the Crayola Portfolio water-soluble oil pastels. And I have some old Prima ones, which I think are Mungio rebranded and more expensive. Now they come in like smaller packs, but I liked those as well. Those three are great options. I would say probably I like the Crayola Portfolio ones just because they're so easy to get and they're so affordable, and they have a really lovely smell of kind of like roses. At least they used to. I don't know if they still do or not, but I don't know if they use like a rose oil or something in them, but they have the nicest smell. And actually I purchased the water-soluble oil pastels a couple decades ago because I really wanted the Caran d'Ache Neocolor 2 crayons, but they were really pricey. And like, well, let me see if I like these first. And I loved them. Not as much as the Caran d'Ache. I ended up buying those too, but I wanted to just kind of get an idea for a similar product to see if I was really going to like them. And yeah, if you want something that's a little bit harder, it's a little bit more opaque and more like gouache, go with the Neocolor 2s. Those are fantastic and will give you a very similar look. But they are different products, and just kind of know that they're different, and there might be a little bit of a learning curve there. But that pretty much does it. My camera's still rolling here because I was probably cleaning my hands off, but I love how this came out, and it was so much fun. And I hope you give something like this a try, either an online art challenge, oil pastels, water-soluble oil pastels. Gel crayons are very similar to water-soluble oil pastels, and they're non-toxic. They're nice for kids because they have a plastic casing. I'm not crazy about the plastic casing just because then you throw it away and it's just trash. So the paper wrapped ones from Crayola are fine with me. And they're also very affordable. But this was so much fun to create. I hope it inspired you to try oil pastels. And if you have any questions, let me know in the comments below. Thanks for watching, and as always, happy crafting. Bye!